Welcome, everybody, to tonight's debate. This House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia. We will start with the table debate, which will be Jack opening the case. So, Jack, whenever you are ready, we will start the motion. This House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia.
Okay, so I think that the Russian state is innately has been doing bad things, right? And that there is something to take action, both in terms of the the background regarding Alexei Navalny, the responses, and what Western governments can and should do in order to be aggressive but not too aggressive when it comes to dealing with Russia, which is never going to be an ally to any Western government while Putin is in power. Now, the first thing I want to characterize is is why Western governments have to deal with Russia in the way that they do, and that is mainly because you have as part of the European Union, you have states that are formally part of the Soviets, which were formerly part of the Soviet sphere of influence, and in the cases of the Baltic states, former Soviet republics that are now member states of the European Union. So we think that Western governments have a duty of care towards these countries that are now allied with the West when dealing with Russia, and we think that the Western government should therefore, when dealing with Russia, have those countries in mind, have their safety and security in mind. Okay, so why do we think that sanctions are justified? So we think that so particularly with regards to Navalny, is that he was in hospital in Germany from suspected poisoning by the Russian state. We have, in terms of all the evidence points towards the fact that it was indeed an act, an attempt to maim the man on behalf of the Russian state. And upon return to Russia, he was jailed, sparking protests. And Navalny has always been a thorn in the side of the Kremlin, a thorn in the side of the Russian government's ability to present a strongman image to the rest of the world. The idea that the entirety of the Russian population was unified behind Putin. That's why, for example, Navalny was banned from standing against Putin in the presidential election, is because he's the only man that could actually feasibly garner enough votes to actually give any challenge to Putin's position and to Putin's popularity. So having established the strategic importance of Navalny, having established the the reasoning behind Russia being bad, why are sanctions particularly good? Why are sanctions the right option? So we think that Russia does trade with Europe. There's no doubt about that. While Russia is not necessarily economically reliant on European trade, it is most certainly reliant. It is certainly trade with the West and trade with Western Europe is something that Russia relies on. So therefore, being able to put sanctions on sanctions on the ability of the Russians to trade in the West in a way that economically hurts the Russians doesn't necessarily economically hurt the West. That is a way that they can express disapproval while keeping safety and security in mind. This is especially considering that we don't think on side government that the current internal goings on merits any form of for example, bumping up of the enhanced forward presence NATO missions inside the former Soviet republics that are now allied with the West, that now rely on the West for safety, security, military presence in order to make sure that the Russians don't try anything. Now, we don't think that that particularly merits any form of. We don't think that internal stuff warrants international action, and if a Western government tried any form of increased military action, we'd be shat on by international organizations for doing so. So therefore, what have I told you today? I've told you that effectively that the Russians have acted in a way that Alexei Navalny as a character is innately innately important to the West purely because he represents a threat to the Kremlin's ability to present Putin as like a unified popular leader, and that their actions have showed that. I've told you that that the West is in a position to hurt Russia economically, to therefore kind of force the Russians to the table on these things, and finally that sanctions are objectively the most appropriate thing to do in terms of like what level of severity do we go for in terms of any Western actions against Russia. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Jack, for opening the side of proposition. Now we move over to the opening of the opposition case with Jordan. So Jordan, whenever you're ready, I'll start you a 5-minute timer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to begin my speech specifically to talk about what is the point of pushing for sanctions when it can't hurt Russia in meaningful ways. In other words, what I'm going to try to explain to you today is how pushing for sanctions in the West is ultimately going to fail and why we need to instead focus on our allies. This speech will focus specifically on not on the deplorable actions of Putin and Russia, but instead the country in which Navalny was poisoned. Germany hopes that the Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline currently under construction, will improve its access to Russia's vast resources of natural gas. Since its inception, the pipeline, which runs directly from Russia to Germany, has been opposed by many in Europe who share America's concerns about the dependency on Russian energy. Some see it as a ploy to allow Russia to stop sending gas via Ukraine so it can escalate the conflict there. After the arrest of Alexei Navalny, the European Parliament voted to cancel the project, but this was to no avail. The row shows that the relationship between Germany and Russia is far closer than generally understood. Angela Merkel has been more reserved in her praise for Putin, but when she and Putin meet, they always speak in Russian. And then just look to the recent row over the vaccines. German politicians reacted almost euphorically to the interim test results from the Russian Sputnik V COVID-19 vaccine at the beginning of the month, compared to the way they scorned the British Oxford Zeneca vaccine after a German official leaked the very false and outright bogus claims that it does not work for older people. The vaccines and the pipeline deepen Germany's dependency on Russia and Russia's dependency on the German market. And if Putin starts to poison his opponents like Navalny, as he did, when asked if she would pull out of the Nord Stream 2 in protest, Merkel said the two issues should be decoupled. The point of where I'm trying to go with this, Mr. Speaker, is that the pipeline and their dependency on the vaccine, particularly in a global pandemic, and the fact that the German government has been moving towards taking on the Sputnik V vaccine over the AstraZeneca, over the Pfizer, over the Moderna, shows that they have a deepening relationship with Russia. And despite whether we could get ourselves, the British government, the Spanish, the Italians, and the French to all go along, or in the United States to go along with the sanctions that are desperately needed against Russia for their undemocratic ways, it ultimately will bear no fruit, because we need to instead be focusing our diplomatic sanctions and our diplomatic time and effort should be on Russia to try to decouple them from their infatuation with Russia. The Biden administration is currently attempting to do this, and we should be supporting them in all of their efforts in order to stop the Nord 2 pipeline. Ted Cruz, the senator for Texas, said recently in November of 2020 that a 95% complete pipeline is a 0% pipeline. And we should consider whether this should be the way we move forward, that if the pipeline is not completed, then there will be no dependency for Germany on Russia. I think that our efforts should be best served working with the United States to find alternative ways to I can take a point of order.
So do you not think that closening ties with Russia on the part of Germany gives it more leverage to encourage Russia to change its ways and not less, and that we should be using that?
I think the problem that we have there is specifically where Angela Merkel specifically said that we have, she wants the issues to be decoupled. And the fact that the European Parliament has unanimously voted to stop the Nord 2 pipeline, also in protest of the poisoning and the arrest of Navalny. And that too has been fallen on deaf ears in Germany. We need to be where I don't believe the Germans quite understand the precarious situation that they're in. And they are specifically trying to move away from the United States and more a European-centric policy, where even Macron in his meeting with Biden specifically said the French policy, the EU policy, is to move away from dependency on the United States, much to Biden's regret. But that is where they're going. But we should also understand that moving away from the United States shouldn't be moving closer towards Russia. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Jordan, for opening the side of opposition. And now we move back to proposition for the second prop speech of the night, which is Gavin. So whenever you're ready, I'll start a timer.
That's me ready. I hope you can all hear me. I'm going to focus more on the individual sanctions, but I just want to mention quickly a piece of rebuttal. Jordan mentions a lot about how negotiations and diplomatic channels are perhaps not as they seem, and I think on this side of the house we would accept that. However, the point being that when Russia makes an action such as poisoning its foes or invading Crimea, for example, you need to take tough action. And if you don't take tough action, and if you talk behind the scenes but don't do anything, then people see that, and perceptively it's not a great look. So I'm going to focus, as I say, on the sort of individual sanctions. So that's the sanctions against the Russian individuals, but I'll also touch on the economic sanctions as well. Firstly, I want to say off the bat that I think Russia is a gangster state. It is a state run by effectively people who were ex-KGB, ex-FSB, and many analysts have pointed it to it being a sort of almost a quasi mobster-run country, which is a pretty weird way of thinking about it, but it's true. So if you take that analogy at its end point, right, what you get to, I will make a bit of progress, but I will take you, George, in a little bit. What I want to say is that if you imagine a New York crime family for a minute, and you imagine you're a police officer or a federal officer or whatever, you don't go after the top of the crime family first. You go after the people around the head of the, let's call it the Gambino crime family or something like that, because the more that you go after the individuals who have influence within the state, but not necessarily Vladimir Putin himself, the more you weaken that individual power that person has. I genuinely think that when we get to a situation that Vladimir Putin and the Russian state changes, ultimately, it will not be because of us. It will be because of internal things that have happened, but as a result of sanctions that have been put in place. Yes, there's different things that we can do, but the prime thing that we can do is to put individual sanctions on people to stop, for example, these Russian oligarch billionaires in London that are able to move assets and move money around as they please and effectively do Putin's bidding, which we know is happening behind the scenes. If George wants to say his POI, he can, but I've made a bit of progress there.
Is proposition throwing stones in glass houses here? Surely we shouldn't be criticising a country which is run by the rich for the rich, where the seamless transition between government and other branches of the establishment, like the military, like journalism. Surely we should get our own house in order and deal with our own billionaires and corrupt politicians before we start pointing fingers at Russia.
Well, George, I think that's what I've pretty much suggested there. I think we need to point the finger, and I think the UK government definitely haven't sanctioned or at least regulated a lot of, primarily Russian oligarchical billionaires who live in London and buy up expensive pieces of real estate. Those people do Putin's bidding, and the way to get at the Russian state is through those individuals, is through that action. And I believe that that's the only probably the main way in which we can bring him down. Secondly, fact, we know what Russia's like. We know that Russia is an abrasive and an aggressive country. You know, look at the subjugation of Crimea, the intervention in Syria, there's interference in other countries' elections. We know that Russia exercises power in this way. So what do? We have to stop money going. We have to stop chemical weapons being used in Syria, which is funded by elements of the Russian state. That's what we have to do. The only way we do that is through economic sanctions, military arms sanctions, but as well as individual sanctions as well. Thirdly and finally, I want to mention very clearly, in Putin's Russia, you have to understand that the West is not viewed in a positive light. Vladimir Putin himself lives an incredibly extravagant lifestyle. You only need to look at Navalny's video to see that extravagant lifestyle and just how really actually care about this issue in Russia. So there is a lot of opposition to Putin in Russia, but what they don't want is a kind of Western influenced electioneering or toppling of Putin. So what we do is we put the sanctions on the people around him, the people who influence him, and him himself. We actually make it more prominent, and Putin has more sanctions on him, or his oligarchs have more sanctions, and they're more well known. And that means that in the end of the day, people will take more notice of it, and there's more chance that we can stop the Russian state. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Gavin, for the second proposition speech of the night. And now we move over to Anttoni for the second opposition. So whenever you're ready, Anttoni, I will start a timer.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to address a couple of the points made so far. In terms of individual sanctions, that's something that's been going on for years, but that hasn't really had any impact. And a lot of what has been described as what Russia has been illegally doing in the international arena, using chemical weapons, that's something that the US has done in Iraq, namely white phosphorus and depleted uranium. Talking about foreign policy, to a large extent, the military foreign policy of the US is run by what could be described as gangsters, essentially people who only make money out of it. Apart from the individual sanctions, I don't know what kind of sanctions are suggested to be implemented. The individual ones against individuals haven't worked so far. They've been going on for years, but they haven't stopped Russia from acting aggressively. On the other hand, if what's being proposed are major coordinated international sanctions, similar to those imposed on Iraq and Iran a while back, one would quite legitimately, I think, ask for after all, if the sanctions are going to be hard hitting on large parts of the population, a population which has had very little say in the leadership of their country and the actions of that leadership, then surely that should be justified somehow. As Solzhenitsyn says in Gulag Archipelago, it's in the nature of the human being to seek justification for his actions. And talking about the human impact of what large-scale sanctions can have, it's well noted that the number of people killed by sanctions in Iraq is greater than the total number of people killed by, say, weapons of mass destruction in all of history. And of course, the violent actions of and the outrageous actions of the Russian leadership, be that poisoning Navalny or former KGB agents in the UK or annexing Crimea, and should be condemned and met with appropriate action. However, I don't believe that any of the suggestions for sanctions that have been suggested so far are going to lead to a change of policy, if that kind of policy, if that's what's being sought. Now, as I see it, the two alternatives from imposing even stricter sanctions, extremely strict sanctions, are as follows. They either lead to even harder line from the Russian state with increased persecution of citizens and far more unstable international arena where a major power backed into a corner is likely to lash out and create worse havoc than we've seen so far. Or secondly, the tough sanctions will lead to an overthrow of power in Russia with new, entirely unknown and unpredictable leadership. Extremely unlikely that that will lead to Mr. Navalny or someone favorable to the West being somehow chosen as the new leader of Russia. Instead, these reruns of constant sanctions in the hope that the world is going to return to the safe predictability of some Cold War détente, which isn't going to happen. Instead of that, we should look at genuine solutions to securing peace and protecting our people as well as Russia's people. And now, as Dostoevsky says in Crime and Punishment, taking a new step, uttering a new word is what people fear most. And it appears to me that the whole debate surrounding Russia, not just in this house, but more widely, remains rooted in what can only be described as outdated Cold War rhetoric. Now, you may hear those on the opposite side of this virtual table talking about how we are being naive and should join the real world, when in fact it's them who need to leave behind their outdated mantras and start thinking about genuine solutions to the issue. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a simple dichotomy of sanctions or no action whatsoever. Instead, I think we should address the issue face in a rational manner and not be hypocrites about who we go after. Yes, we should condemn and go after those who break international law, but at the same time, if we're going to do that, then we need to go after other lawbreakers, be that the US or whoever else. And sure, if at the end of that debate we come to the conclusion that the only option is sanctions, then fine. But I haven't seen any of that kind of rational debates where we actually consider what the implications are going to be and why so far, and I doubt we're going to see it either. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anttoni, for the opposition speech. Now we move back to proposition with Marco for the third proposition speech of the motion. This House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia. So whenever you're ready, Marco, I will start a 5-minute timer.
Right, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be back. So first off, I'd like to say the reason why I believe that further sanctions should be Russian Federation is the following. If you take, for example, a chapter in history, any country that has been oppressive in any nature towards its own people, a citizen, if you will, is outright wrong. It goes against every sense of the moral code, as well as defining what it means to abuse one's human rights. So a very good example is that there were many sanctions that were thrown against the old apartheid South African government because of its oppressive nature of what it was doing and subjugating its citizens. So you take the same example today. This is what you have to do. You have to sanction another country, impose economic sanctions, any form of sanctions, so that they can understand that they are not the only kid on the block. They have to understand that we are all part of a greater team here. We all have to kind of play together, even if we don't like one another. That doesn't matter. We all have to get along some way or another. Now, asking Russia to get along with the West is literally like asking Manchester United and Manchester City to be friends. It's not going to happen, even though they live in the same city, right? However, because Russia is one of the biggest countries in the world economically, as a superpower, military might and all that, it still needs to get along with other countries such as the United States, such as the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. It cannot continue being this almighty superpower that it thought it once was. It now actually has to be a team player, even though that's asking a little bit much because Russia was never a team player. It was always Mother Russia or nothing. Further to that note, if you look at what happened with any other country that was abusing its citizens, Zimbabwe as a good example, they continued, sanctions were implied, but they did not ease up. And now look at where is Zimbabwe today. They don't even have their own currency anymore. They use an inflated currency from the West. and their people are literally starving. So this is what's going to happen to Russia. If they don't ease off what they are doing, because we are implying sanctions, which is completely what we should do, then they are going to go the exact same route as all other, how would you put it politically? The developing countries. It's going to look like any other developing country in the world. And that is not right, because it's asking so much of the people when actually it's not their fault at all. That is the main thing here, is that people are also suffering in this, and it's not even their fault. Why should the people of a country have to suffer because of what one man or one collective government is doing? That's also not right. So even though sanctions are the first thing that we should always look at, and especially the strategy that we use to imply it with, also what we just need to take a look at and use it at a very, very firm course of action is how can we make sure that no government, after we've implied the sanctions, continues doing what it does because it is going to affect their own citizens. And with that, I yield the rest of my time to the speaker. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Marco, for your proposition speech. Now we move back to opposition with Adam. So, Adam, whenever you're ready, I will start a 5-minute timer for you.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm going to oppose tonight's motion because to me, it is another case simply of smoke without fire. It is evident that Alexei Navalny was poisoned and heavily suggested after an investigation into the incident that it was carried out by Russia's Federal Security Service. And it doesn't really take a lot for one to arrive at the conclusion that this was a coordinated, albeit not entirely successful, attack on Navalny in order to intimidate him and his supporters, and was ordered directly from inside the Kremlin itself. It certainly does have all the hallmarks of a situation in which sanctions seem not only the most appropriate response from Western governments, but perhaps more than that, the necessary response. Indeed, whilst I and others are here tonight to argue against such measures, sanctions have already been utilised by Britain and the European Union, including asset freezes and travel bans for top Russian officials, including those working right under Putin's nose and in Siberia where the attack on Navalny took place. But before moving on to talk about the pros, or rather cons, as I would have it, of the use of these measures, it is just worth noting one glaring omission from this latest set of slaps across the proverbial wrist, and that is, as Jordan was mentioning, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. This is opposed by virtually all Western nations, including most of the EU, the UK, and the new Biden administration in the United States, and yet Germany stands up and defends it in the face of the latest authoritarian abuse of power by Putin. It is clear that Germany have now said Auf Wiedersehen to any notion of a united front of Western liberal nations against the abject tyranny that the Russian president subjects his dissenters and opponents to, even within his own borders. The pipeline is merely a route for Russia to exert influence over Germany and consequently the rest of Europe, and is a sign that the economy, or more specifically the German manufacturing industry, is more important to Angela Merkel and the rest of the German establishment than is democracy, or indeed the environment for that matter, with the pipeline really exploiting the energy use such as natural gas, which is so abundant in Russia. But as I don't want to be accused of trying to start World War III, I'll move on to talking about the sanctions themselves. Now, the imposition of sanctions as a measure designed to influence foreign governments, particularly autocratic ones, hostile to Western intervention, has been shown time and again to be a fool's game. Military action is clearly off the table in the hope that, again, we don't start World War III. And so the inevitable question of sanctions come up as a sort of, well, we better do something. But they didn't prevent Russia's continued annexation of the Crimea in 2014, nor indeed the continued proliferation of nuclear weapons by the Iranian regime, even under the disastrous JCPOA deal. To amend the words of Viscount Stair, who many of the lawyers participating in this debate know, it is as if the use of sanctions is like bees without stings in their ability to curb the kinds of actions from autocratic regimes to which the Western world is supposedly unquestionably opposed. I'd further note the comparatively weak calls for action when Saudi Arabia executes its own people for such crimes as adultery, homosexuality, and waging a war on God, whatever that's supposed to mean. And I believe I'm correct in saying that there are at present no formal sanctions being imposed on this ultra-religious medieval cult, which disguises itself as an ally to Western nations. And then only now, Are we finally waking up to the atrocities being committed by the Chinese Communist Party against the Uyghur Muslim minority in the west of the country? The use of meaningful sanctions against Russia, therefore, are not only not going to happen anyway, but even if they did, it would have an, at best, negligible effect on the activities of President Putin. My message to Western governments is that they need to sort out what their priorities actually are, as well as structure a meaningful, coherent, and realistic foreign policy objective. For too long, both fear and greed have ruled the minds of those who supposedly lead these nations that are meant to be built on the ideals of liberty and democracy, only for these precious objectives to simply continue to be taken for granted. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Adam, for that opposition speech. Now we move to the final proposition speech of the night with Helen, who will be whipping. So whenever you're ready, Helen, I will start a 5-minute timer for you.
So my job as the whip speaker is to basically go through what's been said thus far on both sides and kind of point out to you why I think that my side is the winner of this debate. And I'm quite happy to do that this evening for you because I think there's a lot to get through. So let's go through this argument by argument, right? The first thing we hear is that we can't hurt Russia in a meaningful way and that we should focus on shoring up alliances. I think we can do both, right? The example given was the United States, but there's no actual promise that the United States is willing to take a strong stance against Russia. The past 4 years have been quite clear. There's been a leader in charge who is weak on Russia and a leader who's still eligible to run again. So as much as I support like building relationships up with, you know, with the American state, I think that like we can't just sit around and wait for America to take the lead on this. And even if we were going to sit around and wait for America to take the lead on this, America has taken the lead on this situation because they have imposed sanctions on Russia this week. And so they've steamed ahead, and I don't see why other Western nations should not follow. We also had a lot of discussion about Germany and its dependence on leverage over, they have economic leverage over each other, right? Germany has a reliance on Russia for oil and vaccines. Russia has a reliance on Germany for money. Germany is in a strong democratic position because it has other Western nations to back it up. It has the might of the EU, a lot of the UN, the UK, and the US beside it. So Germany is in the position that it can leverage the money it has. Easier to persuade Germany to act in the interest of democracy than it is to like pursue vague diplomacy or de-escalation reasons. Because note, we've heard a lot about we should think about genuine solutions. We should think about other ways of doing this aren't sanctions. This is what opposition has been saying, but opposition has not been presenting tangible solutions. The solution that we on the House present to you is economic sanctions. We're not claiming it's perfect, but we're claiming it should be done. And they're saying, no, we shouldn't do it. We should do something different, and never saying what it is or why that's inherently more effective. Just some fun like meta debating for you. We also heard like we should get our own house in order. You know, don't throw glass stones and don't throw stones from glass houses. A fantastic bit of whataboutism. I think no matter what our situation is as a nation, we should call out when bad things are happening everywhere. If this encourages Britain to change, great, I'm in favor of that. But we should always speak out against immoral actions or actions that undermine the will of the people or the safety of the people. The attempted assassination of a leading opposition figure undermines the will of the people who support that politician. And the way that Russia's cracked down on pro-democracy protesters has been shockingly violent and worthy of condemnation no matter where you are in the world, right? And it's also like to be noted that this isn't the first or even the worst, arguably, offense that Russia has made. It is institutionally homophobic to the point that it like kills gay people. And its treatment of migrant workers during the World Cup stadium building process was also horrendous. And so this is a state that's doing morally bad things. And so a state that should be punished. And this is the easiest way that we can punish the state. And I think we should do that. And if you're so keen on us getting our house in order, speak out against the same issues at home. We can do both. Both these things are possible. Yeah, what else? So we had sanctions don't work. I think it's been brought to you that sanctions do work. And I think sanctions are in the process of working already. So as has been pointed out, apartheid did work. And since sanctions have been imposed, Russia's economy has got weaker. And this is a situation that can and will get worse if more sanctions are imposed. Further pressure on the Russian economy is going to make the Russian people angry and disquiet, and that is not what the Russian state wants. So if these sanctions are imposed where the removal of them is contingent on rectifying the current situation, the Russian state has an interest in doing that so its people don't literally revolt and overthrow it. Apartheid sanctions did work. Yeah, so like this pressure internally and externally is like an incentive, a very strong incentive for Russia to behave and get its shit together, basically. And so, yeah, argument by argument, I think we've proven to you that this is the best course of action that we can take right now, that we have the power to take. And so I beg you to propose.
And thank you very much, Helen, for the closing proposition speech of the night. And now we move on to the closing opposition speech of the night, which is George. So, George, whenever you're ready, I'll start a 5-minute timer.
So, sorry about that. It's not the job of opposition to propose any alternatives to this motion. It is the job of proposition to prove why we should pass this motion. And first side opposition, we do not believe that they have proven this. Prop claim that we have some kind of moral obligation to take action against Russia, and we have some kind of duty of care to form a Warsaw Pact and Soviet states. Why? How? They've never actually proven why we have this duty of care. This paternalistic, imperialist approach to foreign policy is what's driving this new Cold War between Russia and the West. This approach is outdated and should be left in the 20th century where it belongs. Side prop have not convinced me that it is justified for us to try and impose this Western way of thinking upon what is a fundamentally Eastern country. Remember, Russia is Eastern, it is not Europe, it is not Western in our way of liberal thinking. So we cannot hold them to Western Enlightenment values. In an international order, we must allow nation states their difference of character, belief, and culture. As Anttoni on this side of the House illustrated, sanctions have been going on for years and they have had no effect. Moreover, I do say we have no right to throw stones, and I will engage in water battery about this because my case is coming from an anti-imperialist perspective. We can't impose our, we can't say, oh, Russia, you need to get your criminal justice, your extremism cases in order without acknowledging that we have, we are far worse along on our side. Talking about individual sanctions, individual sanctions, talking about billionaires. I was talking about Western billionaires who are in the establishment of this country. So British people like Alan Sugar, Australians like Rupert Murdoch. On statewide sanctions, as Anttoni pointed out, we have no right to throw stones on the use of chemical weaponry. He illustrated that the US use of white phosphorus in the Middle East and how the number of people killed by sanctions in Iraq is greater than any weapon of mass destruction in history. So side proposition saying we should have sanctions on trade that harm Russia but do not harm the West is a fundamentally selfish perspective to come from. The second speaker for proposition actually acknowledged that this is an internal matter for Russia to deal with. So in general, we cannot rightfully try and meddle in a Russian internal justice affair. Now onto the more realistic and pragmatic effects of sanctions. We talked about the cancellation of the Nord Stream 2 project and how Germany overruling the EU. But I would come back against the opening opposition and say that stunningly, Merkel speaks Russian because a woman who grew up in East Germany behind the Iron Curtain does speak Russian. And but in general, his point holds about we need to have a good relations with Russia in a public health crisis. The reason Germany is obviously turning to the Sputnik vaccine is because of the absolute cock-up with AstraZeneca ordering. Finally, I'm about to correct South African's version of his own history, but framing it as just sanctions in regards to regime change in South Africa. It's more than that. It took more than that. It took political action. It took public campaigning. It took sport boycotting. And it's a lot more than just trade sanctions that side proposition are proposing to affect regime change. We must remember that in the context of this debate, no, I can't take a picture right now, Navalny, the cause of this debate, is a far-right nationalist and Islamophobe. If we sanction Russia for carrying out its own internal justice, we endorse and stand by Navalny's hateful comments. Amnesty themselves have acknowledged that he's not a prisoner of conscience and have noted that his comments qualify as advocacy of hatred. The proposition would side with this man. And I have to warn you that some of these comments that I am going to repeat are really quite strong. In 2011, he says that the Russian Federation must distinguish between normal people in the Caucasus, i.e. white ethnic Russians, and freaks in power, by which he means non-Russians who are overwhelmingly non-white and Muslim. He describes the Muslim population of the Caucasus as treating girls universally offensively, when that's not true. The Muslim idea of education is egalitarian and equal. In 2007, Navalny, the cause of this debate, calls for the deportation of foreign-born migrants and saying we have a right to be ethnic Russians in Russia, saying he defends this supposed right. This is not a liberal progressive chap who Western governments should be supporting. So to punish Russia and the Russian people for their rightful action of this is wrong. I beg you to oppose.
And thank you very much, George, for the final opposition speech of the night. Now after that incredibly excellent debate from everybody, we are going to move on to the speeches. So these work differently to the table. They are 3 minutes in length, and they'll go in the order of proposition, opposition, and abstention. Abstention being neither a for or against or both, or just a comment on how the debate went generally. So let's start with proposition. So yeah, who'd like to speak in proposition for the motion? This House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia. Yes, if you spoke on the table, you are allowed one speech on the floor. So yes, Marco, I will start a time when you're ready.
Okay, so what I mentioned earlier is the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa. If you think about it, yes, George, I agree with you. There were other characteristics and components used in order to end a very oppressive government and in order to bring about change. However, if you think about it, the whole world started rallying behind it. If it weren't for the sanctions alone, then the country itself would have remained an economic powerhouse, meaning that it could have continued to trade with major countries, especially strong footholds that we had in terms of allies. So, for instance, during those times, the few allies that South Africa had was, for instance, Israel. Okay, and I mean, I think Israel also had its fair share of fights against oppressive governments, right? So if you don't impose sanctions on a country, then the economy will continue to boom and therefore the country will remain strong. However, if you impose sanctions on a country, then you'll be able to see that a country is going to start growing weaker and weaker because it has nothing that it can go on for itself because no other country wants to work with it. Therefore, the sanctions actually cement everything else. It's the building blocks, the foundation, if you will, for a country to kind of say, hey, listen, maybe what I'm doing right now is actually pretty stupid. Maybe I should actually get the ball rolling and say, okay, I'm going to now need to start playing along with the other kids on the block. Otherwise, I'm not going to get very far, and then I'm really going to see my ass. So that is what we need to do with Russia in this case, is that if there are no sanctions being imposed, or if there are only minor sanctions being imposed, Russia can continue doing what they're doing. They can continue building up their defense force. They can continue building up their economy as a developing nation, which they are. I mean, compared to when they were the Soviet Union, their economy has pretty much boomed. So we need to cement it now and say, listen, cut the crap and let's get down to brass tacks. We need to now work together, or otherwise, you're not getting any dessert. You can't come to the party. I yield the rest of my time to the chair.
And thank you very much, Marco, for the first proposition floor speech of the night. We now open up to opposition. So you'd like to give a 3-minute speech opposing tonight's motion. Derek, yep, that's first hand raised. I'll give you a 3-minute timer whenever you're ready, Derek.
So I would just like to say that I don't think Alexei Navalny is someone who it's worth imposing sanctions on a global power for. I mean, the guy is a massive racist. If you look at some of his past comments where he had his Amnesty International prisoner of conscience status withdrawn for comparing immigrants to cockroaches. He's not the leader of the main opposition party in Russia. And the main opposition party in Russia is actually, funnily enough, the Communist Party in the Russian parliament. He only has about 10% of the vote of people in Russia. Opinion polls support his party. And only about 10,000 people turned out to the mass rally that the press has been covering quite extensively. But basically, to put that into context, more people turned out to UK anti-lockdown protests against us having our civil liberties withdrawn in the UK than turned out to the pro-Navalny demonstrations. So we speak about getting our house in order as well. Now, I noticed that some people were mentioning that Russia had annexed Crimea, intervened in Syria and all that. But that's something that the West has been doing in recent years as well. Of course, the obvious examples being Iraq. We intervened in Syria as well. And Russia intervened in Syria against ISIS. So it was essentially against the same enemy. We also, so we can also do business with Russia, I think. Okay, we might not be friends. We might not be close allies. We won't have the same relation as the UK and the US do. But what I think we should strive to have is an understanding with Russia, because they are, in many respects, a Western country themselves. You know, they have the sort of Western Christian culture that many European countries have. So I think what we should do is have an understanding with Russia, because there's a bigger threat out there, and the bigger threat out there is communist China. And if we were going to sanction Russia, then we just simply drive them into the arms of the Chinese, and we give the Chinese a powerful ally and a buffer zone, and some of our key allies, such as Japan and South Korea, are located very near the borders of China and Russia. So that's putting our own allies at risk as well. So for these reasons, I think we should try and strive to have at least some kind of deal with Russia, rather than sanctioning them and poking the bear with a stick, because it's not going to end well for us. Thank you.
And thank you very much, Derek, for the opposition floor speech. And now, George, for the final speech of the night in abstention to the motion. So whenever you're ready, George, I will start a timer.
Okay, wonderful. So let's talk about cultural relativism. And I don't necessarily believe any of this, or just as I don't necessarily believe any or all of my opposition speech. But I think it's a really interesting question that's raised by debates like this, or any foreign policy debates of, we must punish country X because they have taken an action that we disagree with and we don't like, and it offends our sensibilities. Because from an internal Russian perspective, Alexei Navalny is a criminal. He was a convicted criminal who violated terms of his parole. So from an internal Russian perspective, rearresting him is legit to them. we say, we disagree with you. Alexei Navalny is a political activist and freedom fighter, or freedom leader. So if we are to propose this motion, we are saying that there is some universal cultural values that must be adhered to by all members of the international order. If, however, the opposing view to this, that there is no universal moral values and cultural values that must be adhered to, is true, then it could be argued that Russia is entitled to their own history and culture and way of doing things, because as I tried to illustrate, maybe not very well previously, is that Russia is an Eastern state. It is not West in the idea we think. It did not undergo the Enlightenment in the same way that Western states did. That's the manner of this motion, Western states. So I don't particularly feel I fall on either side of this, because whilst I acknowledge that, oh yes, different cultures have different values and different ways of doing things, I also do feel that I believe in some kind of universal morality that we must abide by. So I think that's a question that all people involved in this debate must be asking themselves, is if there is a legitimate justified reason to intervene in Russia and sanction Russia, then therefore you must also be saying that there is some universal moral code that you are abiding by, which is not something we often see in the Western liberal world.
And thank you very much, George, for the final speech of the night. Okay, cool. Thank you very much, everybody. Now, the way we vote in this house is by raising a hand, messaging in the side chat, or reacting on your screen. So, all those in favour of the motion, this House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia. All those in favour of the motion, please react, raise your hand or write in the chat, and I will count you up. Thank you. And you can lower your hands, thank you. And all those in opposition to the motion, this House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia. So, thank you very much. By the tiniest of majorities, this House proposes the motion. This House believes that Western governments should increase sanctions upon Russia. Before we go on to announce next week's topic, I just want to say thank you very much to really, really successful debate all round. And also a special thank you to Helen, who only found out that she was speaking about 20 minutes before she spoke. So thank you very much.
Well, next week's motion is, so this House would replace human workers with machines. Same time, same place. And if you want to speak, then contact myself or another member of the committee or the Debater Facebook page itself.
Thank you very much, Gavin. So until then, thank you very much for showing up tonight. Hopefully see you at training or competitions throughout the next month, or see you next Thursday at 7 o'clock. Thank you very much, everybody. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. That was a great debate. Cheers.
That was so good. Oh my God, that was.
Yeah, Jamie, but you were an awful host, though. Just gonna.
I am an awful host.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do? Impeach me? I've only got 3 weeks left.